Golden child brother's entitlement went too far. Demanded wife's inheritance, I finally snapped. Parents regretted favoritism. I'm Stephen, 30 male, and my wife is Mia, 28 female. We have been married for 5 years. My brother Keith is 32 male. Growing up, it was pretty obvious to everyone that Keith was the golden child. I mean, it was textbook golden child syndrome for real. Anything Keith wanted, Keith got. If Keith made a mistake, it was always someone else's fault or just a minor thing that could be easily overlooked. Me. Well, I was just Stephen, the dependable one, the responsible one. The boring one, probably, in my parents' eyes. It started from when we were kids. Keith would get the newest video games, the coolest bikes, you name it. I would get hand-me-downs or generic versions of things. It wasn't even about the stuff itself, it was about the message it sent. Keith was special, I was not. If Keith got a B on a test, it was amazing, he tried so hard. If I got an A, it was expected, of course I would. I am just naturally smart. It was always like that. As we got older, it just got worse. When Keith decided he wanted to go to college out of state, even though his grades were just okay, my parents bent over backwards to make it happen. They took out loans, they helped him with everything. When I got into a good state school, they were happy for me, sure, but it was more like a casual pat on the back. No big celebration, no extra help. I worked part-time jobs all through college to pay for my expenses and tuition. Keith, of course, had a credit card provided by my parents for emergencies, which he used for pretty much everything except emergencies. After college, Keith bounced around from job to job. He would get fired or quit after a few months, always with some dramatic story about how it was the boss's fault or the company was toxic or whatever. My parents would listen sympathetically and then, guess what, help him out financially until he found something else. Which usually took a while. I, on the other hand, got a steady job right after graduation and have been working my way up ever since. I'm not saying I am some kind of corporate superstar, but I am responsible and reliable. Qualities that, should be valued. But in my family, it was like being responsible was just normal. Being irresponsible and flaky like Keith was somehow more interesting and worthy of attention. Mia and I started dating in college, and she has seen all of this firsthand. She is amazing, by the way, smart, funny, and incredibly supportive. She always tells me I deserve better from my family, and honestly, she is right. But you know how it is with family. You keep hoping things will change, even when deep down you know they probably won't. A few years ago, Mia's grandmother passed away and left her a decent inheritance. It wasn't millions or anything, but it was enough to be a real help. We used some of it to pay off our student loans and invested the rest. It was a huge relief for us, and it felt like we were finally getting ahead. We were careful with the money and made sure to use it wisely. We talked about maybe using some of it for a down payment on a house in a few years. We were really excited about our future. Now, fast forward to last year, 2023. Keith, surprise, surprise, was in trouble again. He had started some kind of online business that predictably flopped. He had racked up a bunch of debt and was facing eviction from his apartment. Naturally, he went running to our parents, and naturally, they started panicking about how to help their poor Keith. One Sunday, we went over to my parents' house for dinner. These Sunday dinners were a regular thing, something we did to try and keep the family together, even though it often felt more like a chore than anything else. Keith was there, looking all glum and pathetic. My parents were tiptoeing around him, asking if he was okay, offering him extra helpings of food, the whole 9 yards. It was honestly exhausting to watch. Finally, my dad cleared his throat and said, "Stephen, we wanted to talk to you about Keith." Oh boy, here we go, I thought. I braced myself. Dad continued, "Keith is going through a tough time right now, as you know, and we are trying to help him get back on his feet." I nodded slowly. "Yeah, I figured." Mom jumped in. "We were thinking maybe, since you and me are doing so well financially, maybe you could help Keith out a little bit." I stared at them, dumbfounded. Help Keith out? With what? Another bailout, another free pass. I replied, "What exactly do you mean by help him out?" Dad explained, "Well, we know Mia inherited some money from her grandmother, and we were wondering if maybe you could lend Keith some of that to get him through this rough patch." I could not believe what I was hearing. They wanted me to give my wife's inheritance, money that we had worked hard to save and invest, to Keith, to bail him out of another one of his self-inflicted messes. I said, "Are you serious? You want me to give Keith Mia's inheritance?" Mom looked at me like I was being unreasonable. "It is just a loan, Stephen," she said. "He will pay you back when he gets back on his feet." "Oh, a loan. Right. because Keith is so good at paying people back. I wanted to laugh, but it was not funny. It was infuriating. I asked, and when exactly is Keith going to get back on his feet? Has he even started looking for a job? Or is he just planning on starting another get-rich-quick scheme that is going to fail again? Keith, who had been sitting there silently, finally spoke up. "Hey, that is not fair. My business was a good idea, it just did not work out. It is not my fault the market changed." "Oh, the market changed. Of course it did." "It is never Keith's fault," I replied. "The market changed. Keith, you were selling overpriced fidget spinners online. The market did not change, the fad died. Anyone with half a brain could have seen that coming." Keith glared at me. "See, this is what I mean. You are always putting me down. You never believe in me." I just shook my head. It was pointless to argue with him. He lived in his own little reality where he was always the victim and everyone else was out to get him. I turned back to my parents. "Mom, Dad, with all due respect, no. We are not giving Keith any of Mia's inheritance. That money is for our future, for our family. It is not for bailing out Keith every time he screws up." My dad's face turned red. "Stephen, how can you be so selfish? Your own brother is in trouble and you are just going to stand by and do nothing." I could not believe he was calling me selfish. Me, the one who had always been responsible and self-sufficient. While Keith was running around making messes and expecting everyone else to clean them up. I said, "Selfish? Dad, I have been watching you and Mom bail Keith out his entire life. Every single time he makes a mistake, you guys are there to fix it for him. He never learns anything. He never has to take responsibility for his actions because he knows you will always be there to catch him. And now you want me to join in? No, I am done. Keith needs to figure things out for himself for once." Mom started to cry. "How can you say that about your brother? He is family. We need to support each other." I replied, "Support each other is one thing, Mom. Enabling him is another. And that is what you guys have been doing for years. You have enabled Keith to be a completely irresponsible adult. And now you expect Mia and me to pay for it? No, absolutely not." The dinner went downhill fast after that. My parents were furious with me. Keith was sulking and playing the victim. Mia and I left as soon as we could. It was one of the most unpleasant Sunday dinners I could remember, and that is saying something. On the drive home, Mia put her hand on my arm. "I am proud of you," she said. "You finally stood up to them." I sighed. It did not feel good. It felt stressful and upsetting. But I knew she was right. It was something I needed to do, for myself, for Mia, for our future. I could not keep letting my family walk all over me just because Keith was the golden child and I was not. The next few weeks were tense. My parents called a few times, trying to guilt-trip me into changing my mind. Keith even texted me a couple of times, sending me these long, whiny messages about how I was ruining his life and how he was going to end up on the street because of me. I ignored them all. Mia and I decided to go no contact with my parents and Keith for a while. We needed some space and some peace. Then, about a month later, something unexpected happened. I got a call from my dad. His voice sounded different, subdued, almost scared. "Stephen, can you come over?" he asked. "We need to talk. It is about Keith." I was hesitant. I did not really want to go back into that toxic family dynamic. But my dad's voice sounded genuinely worried. So I agreed. Mia came with me. We drove over to my parents' house, not really knowing what to expect. When we got there, the atmosphere was heavy. My mom was sitting on the couch, looking pale and distraught. My dad was pacing back and forth. Keith was nowhere to be seen. I asked, "What is going on? Where is Keith?" My dad stopped pacing and looked at me. "Stephen, Keith is in trouble, serious trouble." My heart sank. What had he done now? Another failed business venture. Another pile of debt. Dad continued, "It is not just debt this time. It is legal trouble." Legal trouble? That sounded bad, really bad. I asked, "What kind of legal trouble? What did he do?" Mom started to cry again. "Oh, Stephen, it is terrible. He got arrested." "Arrested, Keith? Arrested for what?" I was starting to get really worried now. Dad explained he was selling those fake designer bags online. Remember that business he started? Yeah, the fidget spinner 2.0 business. I remembered. Dad said, well, apparently those bags were not just fake, they were counterfeit, and the company whose brand he was counterfeiting found out. They reported him to the police, and they arrested him. He is in jail right now. Counterfeit bags, jail. This was way beyond anything Keith had ever done before. This was serious criminal stuff. Mia and I exchanged a look. We were both shocked, and honestly a little bit relieved. Relieved that maybe, finally, Keith was facing some real consequences for his actions. I asked, "So what happens now? What are you going to do? My dad sighed heavily. We do not know, Stephen. We hired a lawyer, but it does not look good. The lawyer said Keith could face serious charges, possible jail time. And huge fines. Jail time for Keith. The golden child, it was almost unbelievable. Mom looked at me with pleading eyes. Stephen, you have to help us. You have to help Keith. We do not know what to do. Help Keith, after everything. After they tried to guilt-trip me into giving him Mia's inheritance. After years of them enabling his irresponsible behavior. I was not feeling very inclined to help. I asked, help him how, Mom? What do you want me to do? Pay for another lawyer, bail him out of jail. Give him more money, because I am not doing any of that. Dad looked at me, his face etched with worry. Stephen, please, he is your brother. He is in real trouble. We need to do something. I said, Dad, you are right. He is my brother. And he is in real trouble. And you know what? It is about time. For once in his life, Keith is actually facing the consequences of his own actions. And honestly, I think it is exactly what he needs. My parents were stunned. They could not believe I was saying this. They were used to me being the responsible, helpful son, not the son who was, well, maybe a little bit vindictive. Mom said, Stephen, how can you be so cold? This is your brother's life we are talking about. I replied, and whose life were you talking about when you asked me to give Keith Mia's inheritance? Whose life were you talking about when you dismissed all of my accomplishments and always favored Keith? For years you have treated Keith like he is some kind of fragile porcelain doll who needs to be protected from everything. And me? You have treated me like I am invisible. Well, guess what? I am not invisible anymore. And I am not going to bail Keith out of this mess. He made his bed, now he can lie in it. My dad was silent for a moment. Then he said, so you are just going to let him go to jail? You are not going to do anything to help him? I replied, I am not going to give him any money, no. And I am not going to interfere with the legal process. He needs to face the music. Maybe, just maybe, this will be the wake-up call he needs to finally grow up and take responsibility for his life. Mom was sobbing now. I cannot believe you, Stephen. You are being so cruel. I stood up. Mia, let's go, I said. We had said what we needed to say. There was no point in staying any longer. As we walked out of the house, I could hear my mom yelling after me. You will regret this, Stephen. You will regret this. Maybe I would. But in that moment I did not think so. I felt a strange sense of relief, like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. For years I had been carrying the burden of my family's dysfunction. Now finally I was letting it go. The next few months were interesting. Keith's legal case dragged on. He was eventually released on bail, but he had to stay with our parents. The lawyer they hired was apparently not very optimistic. The company was pressing charges and they had a lot of evidence. Keith was facing some serious time. My parents were a mess. They were constantly stressed and worried. They called me a few more times, still trying to guilt-trip me into helping Keith. But I stood my ground. I refused to get involved. Mia was incredibly supportive throughout all of this. She kept reminding me that I was doing the right thing, that I needed to protect myself and our future. Then a few weeks ago the verdict came down. Keith was found guilty. He was sentenced to 2 years in prison, 2 years, for the golden child who had never faced any real consequences in his life. It was a shock to everyone. Especially my parents. I got a call from my dad the day after the sentencing. His voice was quiet, defeated. Stephen, he said, I do not know what to say. You were right about everything. We messed up with Keith. We spoiled him, we enabled him, we never held him accountable. And now this. I did not say anything for a moment. It was strange to hear my dad actually admit that they had been wrong. It was something I had waited my whole life to hear. Dad continued, I'm not asking you to bail him out now. It is too late for that. But I just wanted to say I am sorry, Stephen, for everything. For how we treated you, for how we favored Keith, for everything. You deserved better, that was it. That was all he said, but it was enough, more than enough actually. It was the apology I had never expected to get. The validation I had craved for so long. I replied, thank you, Dad, I appreciate that. We talked for a little while longer. He told me how devastated my mom was, how Keith was in shock. It was all very sad, of course, but I could not help but feel a sense of justice. Not revenge exactly, but justice. Keith had finally faced the consequences of his actions. And my parents had finally acknowledged their role in enabling him. Mia and I are still no contact with Keith, obviously, and our relationship with my parents is complicated, but it is better, much better. They have started to see me, really see me, for the first time in my life. They are finally realizing that being responsible and dependable is not a bad thing. that maybe, just maybe, I'm not such a boring son after all. And Keith, well, Keith is in prison. He will be there for 2 years. Maybe this will be the wake-up call he needs. Maybe he will finally learn to take responsibility for his life. Maybe he will finally grow up, or maybe not. Honestly, at this point, I do not really care anymore. I have my own life to live, my own future to build, with Mia by my side. And for the first time in a long time, I feel like I am finally free. Help me out here, Reddit. Am I the asshole for not helping Keith? For letting him face the consequences of his actions? My parents seem to think so still in some ways, but Mia says I did the right thing. What do you all think? Update 1. The response to my original post was incredible. Thank you all so much for your support and validation. I honestly did not expect so many people to weigh in, but reading your comments has been incredibly helpful. It is really reassuring to know that so many of you think I did the right thing. And yes, for those of you asking, I absolutely will not be visiting Keith in prison. And no, I will not be sending him money for commissary or anything else. He needs to learn to deal with the situation he created. A lot of you asked about my parents and how they are doing. Well, they are still struggling, understandably. But something interesting happened a few days ago. My dad called me again. He said he had been doing some thinking, based on our last conversation and based on some of the comments on my Reddit post that, yes, I did share with him, anonymously of course. He said he realized that they had not only enabled Keith, but they had also, unintentionally, neglected me. He said he felt terrible about it, and he wanted to try to make amends. He asked if Mia and I would be willing to come over for dinner again. Not a Sunday dinner, just a casual weeknight dinner. No pressure, no drama, just dinner. I talked it over with Mia and we decided to give it a try. We went over last night. It was different, very different. For one thing, Keith was not there, obviously. For another thing, my parents were actually listening, really listening. They asked about my job, about Mia's work, about our plans for the future. They seemed genuinely interested in our lives for the first time I can remember. My mom even apologized. Not just for the Keith situation, but for years of favoritism and neglect. She said she realized how much they had hurt me, and she was truly sorry. It was a real apology, not one of those fake, I am sorry you feel that way apologies. It was heartfelt and sincere. I almost cried, to be honest. It was so unexpected. We talked for a few hours. It was not all sunshine and rainbows, of course. There is still a lot of pain and resentment to work through. But it felt like a real start. Like maybe, just maybe, we can actually have a somewhat normal relationship with my parents going forward. It is still early days, but I am cautiously optimistic. Mia is too. She said she could see a real change in my parents, especially my dad. He seemed genuinely remorseful and determined to do better. So, thank you again, Reddit, for all your advice and support. It really made a difference. And thank you for validating my feelings and helping me see that I was not the asshole in this situation. It is still a long road ahead, but for the first time in a long time, I feel like there is hope for my family. Or at least for my relationship with my parents. Keith is still Keith, and he is still in prison. But maybe, just maybe, this whole mess will end up being a turning point for all of us. Update 2. Wow, I am honestly blown away by the continued support and interest in my story. Thank you all so much. It is really amazing to know that so many people are invested in what is happening with my family. And for those of you asking for more updates, here is what has happened since my last post. Things with my parents have continued to improve, slowly but surely. We have been having regular dinners with them, about once a week. It is still a bit awkward at times, but it is getting better. My parents are making a real effort to be more supportive and less critical. They are actually asking for my advice on things now, which is completely new. It is still weird to get used to, but in a good way. My dad has been especially proactive in trying to repair our relationship. He has been calling me more often, just to chat, not to ask for anything or guilt-trip me about Keith. He even helped me fix my car last weekend when it broke down. He is actually pretty handy, something I never really knew because he was always so focused on Keith. It was kind of nice to spend time with him, just the two of us, working on something together. It felt normal, for the first time in a long time. My mom is also trying, although she is still struggling more with Keith being in prison. She visits him regularly, and she is still very upset about the whole situation. But even she has started to acknowledge that their parenting of Keith was not ideal. She has even started going to therapy, which is a huge step for her. She says it is helping her to process everything and to understand why they favored Keith so much. Apparently, it has something to do with her own childhood and feeling like she was never good enough for her own parents. It is all very complicated, but at least she is trying to work through it. As for Keith, well, there is not much to report there. He is still in prison. My parents visit him, but Mia and I have no contact with him and no plans to change that. My parents have stopped asking me to help him, which is a relief. They seem to understand now that it is not my responsibility to bail him out of every mess he creates. They are starting to realize that Keith needs to learn to take responsibility for his own life, even if it is the hard way. One interesting development is that my parents have started to talk about selling their house and downsizing. They are both getting older, and the house is too big for just the two of them. They have mentioned maybe moving closer to us, which would be interesting. I'm not sure how I feel about that yet. It would be nice to have them closer, but it would also be a big change. Mia and I are still discussing it. We are taking things one step at a time. Overall, things are definitely moving in a positive direction. My relationship with my parents is healing, slowly but surely. Keith is still in prison, but he is finally facing the consequences of his actions. And Mia and I are stronger than ever. We are building our future together, and we are not letting my family's drama derail us anymore. Thank you again for all your support, Reddit. It really means a lot. I will keep you updated if anything else significant happens. Update 3. Okay, Reddit, here is the final update, as requested by many of you. A lot has happened since my last post, and I am happy to say that things have continued to improve, in some ways even exceeding my expectations. First of all, my parents did decide to sell their house and downsize. And yes, they did move closer to us. They found a nice condo about 15 minutes away from our place. It is actually really convenient. We see them even more often now, and it is mostly good. We have established a pretty healthy routine of regular dinners, occasional weekend activities, and just general support for each other. It is still not perfect, of course. There are still moments of awkwardness, and old habits die hard. But overall, our relationship is so much better than it was just a few months ago. I actually enjoy spending time with my parents now, which is something I never thought I would say. My mom is still in therapy, and it seems to be really helping her. She is much more self-aware and less defensive than she used to be. She has even started to talk about her regrets about how she treated me and Keith, and how she wants to do better going forward. It is really touching to see her making such an effort. My dad is also doing well. He is more relaxed and less stressed than I have seen him in years. He seems to be genuinely enjoying his retirement and spending more time with us and his friends. And Keith, well, Keith is still in prison, but something unexpected happened a few weeks ago. My parents got a letter from him. It was the first time he had written to them since he went to jail. In the letter, he actually apologized. Not just to them, but to me too. He admitted that he had messed up, that he had taken advantage of their generosity, and that he had been a terrible brother to me. He said he was finally starting to realize how much he had hurt everyone, and he was truly sorry. My parents were shocked. They had never expected Keith to apologize, especially not to me. They showed me the letter, and I have to admit I was surprised too. It sounded genuine. It was not just a superficial "I am sorry, so please send me money" apology. It seemed like he had actually done some real soul-searching and was starting to take responsibility for his actions. I still have no plans to visit Keith in prison or to have any contact with him directly. But knowing that he is finally starting to understand the consequences of his choices and that he is actually apologizing for his behavior, it is something. It is a small step, but it is a step in the right direction. Maybe, just maybe, when he gets out of prison, things will be different. Maybe he will actually have learned something from all of this, or maybe not. Only time will tell. But for now, I am focusing on the positive changes in my life and in my relationship with my parents. Mia and I are doing great. We are still saving for a house, and we are planning a vacation for next year. Life is good. It is not perfect, but it is good. And a big part of that is because I finally stood up for myself and refused to let my family's dysfunction control my life anymore. And for that, I am truly grateful. So thank you again, Reddit, for all your support and encouragement. You helped me through a really tough time, and I am so glad I shared my story with you all. It really does get better. Sometimes you just have to stand up for yourself and make it happen. And sometimes, even golden children can learn a lesson, eventually. That is the end of my story for now. Thanks for listening. Thank you for watching. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do so and hit the notification bell to stay updated with more shocking real-life stories happening around you.